Hello and welcome to another training video. Now in our last video we took a look at Excel pivot tables and how you could set up a pivot table and not be scared by what they are. And in this video we're going to take a look in much more detail at the kind of things you can do with the pivot table once you've actually got it created. So without any further ado, this is our file we're going to use. This is the data itself. So if I scroll down, this is a list of things that happened. So these are sales. And I've created my pivot table over here, and this is a summary by different makes and different months. Now, if I click inside the pivot table, I get these two extra ribbons, Pivot Table Analyze and Pivot Table Design. If I click away from my pivot table, they disappear. And the reason for that is they're what we call context-specific ribbons. In other words, they only appear when they're needed. Now, I can't do anything to a pivot table when I've got this cell selected because it's not part of a pivot table. If I have this cell selected, all of a sudden I can do things to this particular pivot table because that's what I've got selected. The same happens within a normal table. So you remember we turned our data into an Excel table. We have a special context ribbon for that table. If I click away from the data, the table ribbon disappears. If I click back inside the data, the table ribbon reappears. Now in both of these, the first thing you should do once you've turned the data into a table is give it a name. And the name that I've given this is F sales. Now the F prefix is for fact. Each of these things is a true record of something which happened, otherwise called a fact. So this whole table is a list of facts or things that happened. When I go to my pivot table, this I've prefixed with PT for pivot table. Now I've also renamed the sheet that it appeared on, and I use uppercase PT for the sheet name, lowercase pt for the pivot table name, and this helps me when I'm doing some analysis referring to this file for externally. I can see the component parts, I can see at a glance which one is a sheet, which one is a pivot table. Now, let's take a look at some of the options to do with this particular pivot table. And bear in mind they are to do with this table, not any other table that I had selected. So I'm not changing the defaults here. We will look at how to change the defaults when I've been through this. Now, below the table name, I have the options. But a lot of people don't realize there's a dialog next to it with three different choices down the side. Let's have a look at just the straightforward options to begin with. We have 6 different tabs along the top, and most of these things are self-explanatory, so what I'm going to do is just focus on a few of them which I think are most useful. Where we have for empty cells, show a hyphen. So this is similar to accounting format. Instead of showing loads of blank cells where nothing has been entered, what I want to do is I want to have a hyphen in that cell. And a hyphen is different to a 0. Yeah, so I'll have a hyphen where there is no value in that cell. Under the filters at the moment I'm showing my grand totals for both rows and columns. Now one thing to notice about these dialogues is they're not dynamic, so they're not giving me a live preview. If I make a change here, I need to apply it before I actually see the change. So if I'm not sure what to do, click on it, apply it, and then see what change it's made. So I turn off the grand total for rows, that's turned off my row totals, but if I want to turn it back on again, I need to come back in here to options and turn it back on again and click OK to actually see them again. Yeah, so that can seem a bit of a long-winded way. Now the reason we don't have the live preview is because this is a very old setting, so this has been in here as long as we've had pivot tables, and live preview is a much more recent feature. Display. The only one in there really worth watching is the classic pivot table. So this is the new pivot table. We have the field list on the right hand side. Classic pivot table was all on the pivot table, and you could drag the fields from one area to the other. So for example, I could drag make from here up to the top, and that would then become a column rather than a row. The new way of doing it is dragging it over here. Most people have now got used to this. When it first came out, everybody was switching back to the classic view because that was the one that they knew how to use. Now the other option we have here within display is the sorting list for this list of fields, so the sort order for the list of fields. At the moment, and the default is to be sorted in the data source order, but you may choose to have them alphabetically, depending on whether you know the name of the field or not, and also how many different fields you've got. So if you've got a table with 100 different columns on it, it might be easier to find them alphabetically, but if they're properly sorted as a data table already, or properly ordered as a data table, and the ones that you want to use for groupings are towards the left of the table, then it makes sense to have them in the same sort order as the data. Printing, fairly self-explanatory. Data, you may choose to refresh the data when opening the file. Now that will be refreshing this particular pivot table when you open the file, and what that means is it will then again look at the source of the data to see if it's changed. Now, you might not want to do that with every pivot table, but certainly if you do want to do it, it's worth actually setting it so that it automatically updates when you open the file. Alt text, well, this is something that you should use. It's for people who have screen readers who are not the best at viewing stuff on the screen. The device they have on their machine, as they hover over it, the machine will read out whatever you have here in a voice format for them to be able to understand what they hovered over. It does make it useful for people who could perhaps see the numbers but can't necessarily see where their mouse is. So as they move around, it then reads out what you hovered over, and then they can click to do other actions. So I've just put in pivot table, not very descriptive, but the reason I've made those settings in here is so that I can then use this as an example for my default settings, which I'm now going to change. So these options here are to do with the specific pivot table that I've got selected. If I now go into File, Options, and Data, I have my pivot table settings up here, so I can say Edit the default layout. So this is now my default settings for all pivot tables. Now I can choose to import the settings that I've just made on this particular pivot table in as my new defaults. Now if I come down here, again, this dialog is now, I've only got the 5 options along the top, and these are the settings by default for all new pivot tables I create. And just to demonstrate that, if I come to data, you'll notice that the refresh data when opening the file, that has already been set. So now when I click OK, and for those who are interested, the one that's missing is the alt text. If I now click OK, that will now be my new default settings for any pivot table that I create. Now the one thing that is very useful about that is over here, the report layout. If I have it in compact form, which is the default normally, it just says row labels and column labels, which is kind of meaningless. Whereas if I go into tabular form, it actually gives me the name of that field that I've used in my rows or my columns. So that makes much more sense. And again, that has now been set as my default setting. And that saves a huge amount of time rather than having to change it every single pivot table you create. Okay, let's have a look at some of the other things in this drop-down. So we've looked at the options. Now report filter pages are at the moment grayed out. Now the reason is because I have nothing in my filters. If I were to drag salesperson down into my filters, now what I can do is I could filter this pivot table by any one of my unique list of salespeople. Yeah. If I go back to all, this is showing me the whole data set. Okay. How's that useful? Well, here, my report filter pages are now no longer grayed out. If I click on there, I get a choice of any of the filters that I had put in here, and I'm only going to do the one that I've put in at the moment. Now I have 3 unique salespeople. What the machine is going to do when I click OK is it's going to create a copy of this pivot table as a new sheet for each individual unique item within this filter list. So when I click OK, I get 3 new sheets, one for each of my salespeople with the filter applied for that particular salesperson. Now you might be looking at this thinking, fantastic, that's what I've always been waiting for with pivot tables. Yes, but it has a huge caveat. This has a name and the name relates to the filter that the machine applied, but the filter can be changed. So I've now changed this. This data here is now Fred's data, but the sheet name stays as Belinda. This can be very confusing. It can also mean that if I then send this sheet to somebody, the other person can still filter it. Yeah. So they can filter it so they could see data that maybe they shouldn't be able to be seeing. Now the other problem with this is I no longer have control over what filter's been applied. The only time I've really used this is part of a VBA routine, so code routine, where I create the report filter pages, PDF them, and then immediately delete them. So that's the way that I would do it. I would create the report filter pages, PDF them, delete them, and then as part of the routine I might email them out to certain different people. That way only the data that they're supposed to be seeing is what they see. I'm going to take salesperson out of my filters, and let's go back into our pivot table analyze. Now the next thing along in our drop down is generate get pivot data. So get pivot data is a function, and what it means is, do I want to use the function when I refer to a value cell within my pivot table? So I can't do it over here, but I can do it with any of my value cells, and my value cells include the totals. So these are my value cells, and what I'm going to do is just choose that one there. Now if I refer to that cell, I could refer to it in two ways. I could refer to it as B5, or I could refer to it as the cell which is showing me BMWs in January. That is the get pivot table data way, and the B5 is the non-get pivot data. So if I click over here and I say this cell equals, and I click on that one, because I've got get pivot data selected, it's going to get pivot data, and it says I'm going to get the price, which is sum of price, from A3. I'm then going to get my month from January, and I'm going to get my make from BMW. So this is a filter showing me the sum of price for BMWs in January. Okay. If I now just go back to my pivot table analyze ribbon and I uncheck that, so I just click on it once, and if I go back there you'll see that it now no longer has the check next to it. If I now refer to that same cell, so I say this cell equals, click on that cell, it just refers to B5 rather than the get pivot data, which is what that currently says. Okay, so how could we check this? How can we see it making a difference? Well, if I put my filters down for the months, that cell there that is getting the pivot data for the month of January is now coming up with an error because it can't find the month of January within my data. If I go back and I show January, it's now giving me the data, but this cell here is referring to B5, and B5 is now that cell there. So it's given me a different value. Okay, let me delete them, and I'm going to go back in and take out my month filters. And I'll put months back in the columns. And you'll notice when I dragged month down into the filters, it took it out of columns because I can't actually have it in both at the same time, just the way pivot tables work. So we've looked at all of these different options here. I would advise leaving it turned on as a get pivot data. That is generally what you want, and it is the default. Now the next thing we have over here is our active field. Now my active field at the moment is the sum of price, which is my value field. If I click down here, I'm now in the make field. If I click over here, I'm now in the month field. If I now come across to field settings, this is the settings for the particular field that I've got selected, or my active field. Now there's a few different things down here. I might want to show my subtotals. If, for example, I had make and then I had a subgrouping or a child group, which is all the different models within that make, I might want to show a subtotal for my makes at the end of each make. At the moment I'm going to show it as none. When I go to my layout and print, the other option I've got is to show items with no data. In other words, if I'd filtered out a whole make because of one of the settings, that would still be visible but with zeros or dashes because I'm showing the items with no data. The advantage of this is it means my pivot table structure, the shape of the pivot table, stays the same irrespective of what filters I've applied, and they're also included in any charting that I create, but they'll be shown as a 0 on the bars or the lines rather than as not being there at all. Okay, so these are the settings. The next thing to look at is the groupings, and let's see how this works. And it's actually very clever. So I'm going to choose some of these items, and I'm holding down Control just to choose multiple items at the same time. Now I've chosen, let me choose that one, that one, that one, and that one. So I've chosen 4, and I'm going to group these together as being European makes. Now down here you'll notice I've missed out Volkswagen. VW will be very upset about me not including them, so I'll put them in later. So if I now group them, I can choose that group and I can call that, let's just say, EU. So that group is my EU group. This one here is USA, but it only has one item in it, so I can simply rename it up here. Now these ones down here, my Hyundai, Kia, Mitsubishi, Nissan, Toyota, I'm going to now group them all together as well, and I'm going to rename them East. Now I realise that actually I wanted VW to be part of that group. Now what I can't do is choose it and drag it, but what I can do is ungroup this one and then select them all again and select VW as well, and then click group and rename it. Now the beauty of this is over here I now have make and make 2, but I might want to rename make 2 something else. So I'm going to click on there and I'm going to call this region of manufacture, and that makes much more sense, so I can now at a glance see something that I can group by. Now if we go back to these field settings, we'll see how we might want to have our subtotals visible. So that now gives me a subtotal for all of EU, a subtotal for all of USA, and a subtotal for all of East. So that's what that subtotal setting does. I'm going to turn it back to none, because another way of doing that is by saying, well, if I want to see the subtotal of EU, why don't I just see EU and not see the individual makes? So I can take make out of there, and now I'm just seeing the region of manufacture. If I take make back down underneath region of manufacture, what I also have is these little plus and minus buttons. Now if I click on that button, it shrinks it down, so it rolls it up or unrolls it. Now those buttons there are absolutely useless if I'm printing this off or PDFing it, so what I might want to do is turn the buttons off so the buttons are not visible, and that's what that option up there is for. So I'm going to turn it back on so I can see it. Now the other thing about these is if I were to select all of these and ungroup them, the fact of me having grouped them before will no longer be remembered. However, if I do it differently, if I simply take the region of manufacture out of my rows, when I look back up here in my pivot table fields, I still have the option for region of manufacture. And the machine will recognize the hierarchy of the region of manufacture and know that it should go in the rows. So if I ungroup them all completely, that will disappear. But if I simply drag it out, I can then choose to reuse it whenever I like. And that can be very useful. Okay, let's now have a look at the slicer. So I mentioned that I don't like using filters apart from creating report filter pages. Slicer is a much better way of doing this. Click on Slicer, Salesperson, and there is my slicer. Now a slicer is just a filter. There are some issues that I'm having with slicers. However, on the whole, they're fantastic and there's no reason not to use them as part of your pivot tables or pivot charts. They are utterly brilliant. There are, like I say, a couple of issues and I'll talk about what they are. And it might be that you know the way of fixing them. If so, please let me know. Now, what I'm going to do is within my slicer, I've changed it to a different number of columns, and I've actually made it 4 columns, just so that you can see what happens when I update the data. So I've just resized that, and you'll notice that my slicer is fantastically snapping to cell sizes, which is very useful. Now the reason it's doing that is because of a setting that I've put in the slicer. So just like the pivot table, the slicer itself has some settings, and if I go over here to my slicer settings, I can change them, but this particular one is quite well hidden. It's underneath the Align button. So if I click on Align, I've got the option to snap to shape or grid. Now, snapping to a grid is the one that you want. Now what that means is that as you resize, it snaps to the cell sizes, which is fantastic. Now if I reposition that, I can then say snap it there. You'll notice that the available space within it is still set to 4 columns. So that gives me space for me when I add myself under the data. Now how does a slicer work? Well, I simply click on it and it filters the data down below according to whichever one I select. Now you will notice that because I'd set this pivot table to include anything where there was no data, it's still including a Hyundai with a load of zeros, even though Fred didn't sell any Hyundais. And for Joe, it's doing the same if there are any models he didn't sell, and of course, that's true for all of them. So if I want to apply a filter, I could click on Control. I'm now seeing Belinda and Fred. If I want to clear it, I click on there. Slicers are fantastic because I can have a slicer for more than one thing. So let's add another slicer. Click on here, Insert Slicer, and let's do for payment. So this is showing the payment type that the customer chose. Again, I'm dragging it wider, making it multiple columns, and I'm going to reposition it at the top. And it's snapping to cell sizes again. Now again, I can filter by salesperson and now payment type as well. And we now have the 2 slicers attached to the same individual pivot table. So let's go back to our pivot table Analyze. Because underneath here, we have the option for the filter connections. And this is showing me what slicers or filters are attached to this particular pivot table. And you see that I've got the 2 slicers. I've got salesperson and payment. Now if I were to uncheck payment and click OK, my data is now updated, so it's no longer linked to this slicer. The slicer is still there, but I'm no longer linked to it. This one is still working and still filtering the data, but this one now has no effect whatsoever. If I click back in here, go back to my filter connections, it does show me that other slicer and any other slicers I have within this workbook, and I can choose to connect them again. And now when I click on here, it's also filtering that particular pivot table. Now, what else can I do? Well, actually what I could do is I could go into the slicer itself and do effectively the reverse of that. So on the slicer ribbon, I can look at the report connections, and it shows me that at the moment I've only got one pivot table, and that pivot table is affected by this slicer. Now, where that's useful is I could have multiple slicers and multiple pivot tables or pivot charts, and have one slicer filtering all of my pivot tables and pivot charts. Now this is not something that you can do by putting a filter in here. You'd have to go through and individually filter each of your charts. Slicers, you can click on it once and it will filter everything in one hit. So fantastic, huge step up from just using these filters. Very easy to see, very easy to understand, and quite intuitive. Okay, let's go back into our pivot table analyze, and we're going to have a look at the timeline now, but just to clean up the screen a bit, I'm going to delete this one. Now the way you delete a slicer is you click on it once and then press the delete key, but make sure that you've cleared the filters before you do so, otherwise you'll delete the slicer with the filter still applied. Now that's not the end of the world. If I delete that slicer, you'll notice that the filter is still here and I can still see that filter has been applied, and I can remove the filter either by select all or clear filter to get it all back again. Now I'm doing Control Z to try and undo, and you'll notice it's not doing anything. Now the reason is because in order to speed things up and save memory, one of the options that I set within my pivot table was to, in fact within my overall options within the data area, is not to include undo steps within pivot table updating and refreshing. This means I don't have to store two copies of the same pivot table. I just store the live copy. I'm going to put that slicer back in, and then we're going to have a look at the timeline. So make it 4 columns. Okay, timeline. Now, my previous data, I couldn't insert a timeline. Now the reason I couldn't insert a timeline was because I don't actually have any columns with dates in them. Now this is very specific. I need to have a date. That is not a date, that is JAN. That is some text, which is 3 letters. None of these are actually dates or months or anything remotely connected to dates or time. They're just simply text. What I have done in this file is I've also included a timestamp. So these timestamps do relate to the initial data, but this is much finer granularity, in other words much more detail, and therefore much more useful. So every sale took place at a certain point in time, which has now also been recorded in my data, and you should always be looking for this. And generally speaking, this is something that defines your data as fact data. So this is a fact because it has a timestamp of a thing that happened at a certain point in time. Now I've also taken it further, and I've also done some analysis on the day of the week and even the hour of the day. So we can see later on how we can include that within our pivot table to do even more detailed analysis. But if I just had month, I couldn't use my timeline. So I'm going to go over here, click inside the data, and I'm going to say insert a timeline. Now from all of the list of fields that I have, it's only going to show me the ones that have date data within them, data type. Now mine doesn't have straightforward date, it has date time. That is still acceptable. I'm going to choose timestamp, click OK. I now have a list of all the different months, and if I go across to the left I can click on just January. I'm now seeing my data for just January, just February, January and February. Yeah, so very useful. If I go across to April, well, I don't have any data for April. So timeline, very useful. I can also do this by days, and again I can go back to January, look at January the 1st. So I've only got one sale made, and that sale was made for a Toyota, and I can clear the filter. Now again with the timeline, this is just a filter. If I delete it, I should have cleared the filter beforehand. Otherwise it would have put a filter on the field that I've used. Okay, let's now have a look at the refresh options. So we have the choice of refresh or refresh all. Generally speaking, just use refresh and point to the particular pivot table you want to refresh. It might take a long time to refresh all. It's not just all pivot tables, it's all of your data sources and everything else within your sheet. So try and avoid doing refresh all unless you've only got a small amount of data coming into your summary. If I add some data at the bottom of my table here, so I'm going to say that I've joined as a salesperson and I sold a BMW, and let me put a date in there as well, and I'm going to put in today's date. And I sold it at midnight, surprisingly enough. So now when I go back here, I've not been included. I've not appeared in my filters. Now this is one of the things which I find quietly frustrating about the filters, the slicer filters in particular. If you know why it does this, then please let me know. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh this particular pivot table. So I could either go up to my pivot table, analyze and choose refresh, or I can right click within the pivot table and choose refresh. That's the one I prefer to do. I have now appeared as a salesperson, and the individual month, which has been left blank because of the date that I had put in, and the individual month should be June, but because I hadn't put it in my individual month, so if I go back to my data, I should have put in JUN. Remember, that is just some text. So my headers are this column, which is just some text, rather than the month component, 3 letters, of this field here. So now when I go back over here, again it's not showing, but as soon as I refresh, it will now show. So that's now showing as June, nothing, 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 because I sold it for nothing. I gave away my BMW. Okay, now here's the thing that I find frustrating. If I go back to my data and I remove that row, I no longer exist as a salesperson. That sale no longer exists. So if I go back to my pivot table, right click, refresh, June no longer exists because that data has been taken out. But I'm still there. Now you might say, well, that's because I refreshed the pivot table and not refresh all. I'm going to right click here. I'm going to say refresh. I'm still there. Now even bigger than that, if I delete this and then reinsert it as a slicer, I'm still there. I'm still there with no items, but for some reason the machine is remembering the fact of a list that it created for that particular slicer. So that can be a bit of a pain. Now, as far as I know, if you turn the machine off and back on again, so if you've saved the file and you then reopen the file, that will then be cleared, and it's just a temporary fact of it storing that. However, it can still be a bit of a pain. Okay, let's go back and move on. So changing the data source for this pivot table. If you've done it correctly, if you've referred to a table as your data source, you never ever need to do this step. However, if you just referred to a range of data and you haven't turned it into a table, this particular range of data would end at row 104. If I then added myself underneath, my pivot table would still be looking at rows down to 104 and not the next one down. So what I would need to do is redefine the range of data. So I need to change my data source and redefine the hard-coded in range. Now, because I referred to it correctly from a table, it's going to work. So if you do this correctly in the first place, you never need to do that step. You never need to redefine the data source. This next one, a lot of people never ever use, now with good reason. However, it can be incredibly useful. If you want to select the pivot table, the easiest way of doing it is actually to select all of the cells which include the pivot table. I could now move, delete, whatever I want with this pivot table. However, I have the option here to click clear all. What this will do is it will leave the pivot table there, but it will take out any pivot table fields that I'd already put in, and I'm not going to do that because then I have to actually put them all back in individually because I don't have the undo steps. Now the next one, well, everything's grayed out, apart from selecting the entire pivot table. So rather than me clicking and dragging over, particularly if it's a large pivot table, what I can do is just say select and select the entire pivot table. Now once I go in here, it's now enabling me to select different parts within that pivot table. So if I just select the values, it's just the numbers or the stuff in here. If I select my labels, it's these column and row labels or the column and row labels. Now why am I to do that? Well, the answer is formatting. If I want to apply some formatting, I probably want to do it like that. I also have the option for selecting labels and values, which is actually the same as the entire pivot table. Now if I don't want to do that, I can disable selection, and now when I click on here, the only thing I have able to select is the entire pivot table, not these individual things down here. As soon as I've selected the entire pivot table, that also enables the selection of the subparts. Okay, if I want to move a pivot table, I click on there, and it now says where do I want to move it to, so I can choose to move it to a different sheet, for example. But there's another way of doing it. So I'm going to make a new worksheet, and I'm going to call this report, and it might be that I've made my pivot table and I wish to move it to my report sheet. Now there's a couple of ways I can do this, and I'm going to show you both. So, and remember that there's no undo step. So if I go to my pivot table and I say select the entire pivot table, and now if I come over here and I put my cursor on the boundary of the box, and I can click and drag, and that will move my pivot table. But if I want it to go to another sheet, if I go to hover over that sheet, it simply thinks I want to drag it down. But if I hold down Alt at the same time, it will move me to that other sheet. So if I now let go, now the thing that you might not have seen is at the same time as me holding down Alt, what I was doing was holding down Control. Now if I just left it holding down Alt, my initial pivot table would not be here anymore because I would have been moving it to my report sheet. By holding down Control at the same time, this is now a copy of that pivot table. It's not linked, it's not the same pivot table. Both of them are linked to my initial data, but it's taken a copy of it and put it on this report sheet. And you'll notice that by the pivot table name, it's just given it pivot table 20. Now I might call this PT Sales Report rather than PT Sales. Generally speaking, I would do that only if this formed a sub-report and this was a master report, because bear in mind this is a copy and it's not linked in any way to that one there. So any filters that I apply to this one are not going to be applied to my report. However, we know now that we can use our slicer settings and change the report connection, so I can copy a slicer from this one to the other one and then link it to the other one instead. Or I could have my report filter pages, so my slicers here, also affecting the pivot tables on other individual report sheets. Okay, let's go back to our pivot table analyze. Now we're going to have a look at this one over here called fields, items and sets. Now this is slightly confusing for a lot of people. A field, these are my fields. So if I add a field, it's effectively adding in a whole new column, which I could do in my data. So I could come over here, and if I wanted a column called VAT, I could add in a column called VAT, which is 20% of the price. Why would I not do that? Why would I insert a calculated column or calculated field over here? Now the reason is because if I do it as a field, it does the calculation on the summary. If I do it in my data, I'm doing a calculation on every single row of data. Now it only becomes an issue if I have millions of rows of data and then I have millions of calculations. And I then have 20 here, and I then have 20 calculations. So that's a big difference if I have to do a calculation 1,000,000 times or 20 times. In this instance, I would do it in the data, and I would do all my calculations in the data because it's such a small data set. If I were doing this for a supermarket sales where I had 500 million rows of data, I would absolutely not do it in the data. I would do it here as a calculated column, or as a measure if I were using Power Query, which is what I would use. So the way this works is, if I come over here and click on the drop down, I have the option for a calculated field because it doesn't matter where I'm clicked. But I don't have the option for a calculated item. If I want to do an item, I need to be in the header for the items. Now I can do a calculated item. First of all, we're going to do a calculated field, but my advice would be always click in one of the headers, because then you have the option of being able to choose either one of them. So I'm going to choose calculated field. I'm going to call this field VAT, and I'm going to do a calculation for my VAT. So my VAT equals price times 20%, so times 0.2. I'm going to click OK. I now have my sum of VAT, which is 20% of that sum of price. My sum of VAT has been put in here, and again, if I take it out, scroll down, I have VAT as an option. That's a calculated field. Now, if I come down here and I click on calculated field again, this will be putting in a new field. But what you might notice is the drop down here. If I click on that button there, I can now go into edit existing fields. So let's imagine in some bizarre world VAT were to reduce to 15%. I can now click OK, and that will have updated my sum of VAT. Now, because I did it from here and I was editing the existing one which I've taken out, all I've actually done is edited that one. Now if I drag it back in, this is now showing me my 15% VAT rather than the 20. Okay. If I go back into here, select my VAT, I can also choose to delete that calculated field, click OK, and now I no longer have my VAT calculated column to use. My recommendation were, if you set it up, keep it in there. You can then use it if you choose to, or not use it if you choose not to. Okay, so that's a calculated field, and it appeared for each of my options. So I appeared with VAT for January, February, and March. A calculated column is different to a calculated item. So a calculated item means just one column within my pivot table. Now the item that I might wish to do might be February minus January. So this will show me the increase in sales between February and January. So that will be one specific thing. So that's what I'm going to do here. Now again, make sure you've clicked in the header before you start. So calculated item, and I'm going to call this Feb minus Jan, because it's only going to appear once, and it is Feb, not Meb. Minus Jan. That's really weird because actually the F key is nowhere near the M key on the keyboard. Now, I am going to delete what's in there. So I always delete what's in the formula before I start using it. Now what I'm going to do is, over here I have a list of the fields and the items within those fields. So I'm going to choose the month, and I want to choose the month of February. So I click on there, and then I can say insert item. Now I don't want to do that because I'm lazy, so I double click there and it inserts February. I then do minus, double click on January. So my calculation for Feb minus Jan is that this column equals Feb minus Jan. Click OK. Now it goes furthest to the right. I don't want it furthest to the right. I want to move it. So if I come here and click, I can actually click in a certain place that will select just that data within my pivot table. The other way of doing it is if I click and drag downwards, I can select that one, and now if I move, I can reposition the whole of that column somewhere else. Now, the thing to note about this is my grand total is the sum of all the stuff to the left, including that column that I've just put in. So my grand total is now no longer the same as it was before. My grand total is now garbage because it's including the difference between this one, and it's counting it twice. So I do not want to use grand total if I've got some calculated column in there which is using two of the columns to make the calculation. So my grand totals, the way we turn them off, we go to Design, Grand Totals, On for columns only. That turns it off for my rows. These grand totals down here are still relevant, but the grand totals for my rows are not relevant. Okay, if I want to get rid of that one, again, I can come up here to my Analyze, make sure I'm in the header, Calculated item, make sure I select the one that I want, and say delete, and it's gone. Now the calculated items do not appear in the field list because they're not fields, they appear in the pivot table, and they only appear in the pivot table where I put them. Once I've deleted it, I can no longer use it. So make sure you only put it in as you need it, and if you delete it, make sure you're not going to need it again in the future. Okay, we're going to move across to the right hand side now. So where it says pivot chart, most of the time you don't want to see your data just like this as a pivot table. You probably find it easier to see it as a chart. So if I click on that chart there, I'm now seeing my individual make with colors for the different months. I could switch this around. So if I go to my pivot chart, I can move what's in my legend to what's in my axis, and you'll notice these are different. This is my columns and my rows, and if I move month and make, it does also do it in the pivot table. Yeah. So now I'm seeing my January, February, March with the different makes of car and the different sales going across January, February, March. Now that there is quite untidy because I've got lots of different makes of car. I would probably prefer to have it showing the other way, but if I wanted to see a trend, then it's essential that I have my units of time going across the horizontal axis. So what do I mean by a trend? Well, if I wanted to see what the trend for sales of BMW are, I can click on the BMW icon, and in my format settings, in my design settings, I can add an element, and I can add a trend line, and I can do a linear forecast, and I can say that based upon my increase in sales January, February, March, my BMW should be increasing like that. Now 3 months is a very, very small sample, so it's going to be inaccurate, but that's a very simple linear forecast which might be useful. If I click on the component, delete it, it's gone. That would not work if I had these the other way around. So if I had my make and month the other way around, if I'm doing that, I'm now selecting January and comparing across the different makes. So assuming I added a new make, what would I expect that make to sell? And that's totally dependent upon the order in which these are sorted. So they're sorted currently alphabetically, but if they were sorted in order of the biggest seller, that would make completely no sense because a new make that I added would always be the smallest seller. If I have January, February, March, these are periods of time, so you generally want your periods of time running across the horizontal. Pivot charts behave just like charts, but they're a chart based on the pivot table. So any changes I make to the pivot table will feed through into the chart. If I remove columns or fields from here, they'll be taken out of my chart. If I apply a slicer here, it will apply to my chart as well as the pivot table. You do need a pivot table for a chart to be based upon. Now, if I go back to my original data, if I go to Insert, I do have the option to insert a pivot chart directly. However, it will also include a pivot table. Even though I have two different options here, one of them says just inserts a pivot chart and the other one says chart and table. Let's see what happens if I just insert a pivot chart. So there's the range. I'm not going to have it on data model. I'm going to have it on a new worksheet. And I'll click OK. Well, guess what? It's put in both. So it's put in a chart and a table. The only difference is here. I have my chart fields as the default setting with legend and axis, rather than my pivot table, which has columns and rows. But it doesn't matter which one I choose if I have my salesperson and my make, or the other way around, and then my sum of price in the values. All it's actually doing is populating both of these at the same time, and it's no different to if I had created a chart and a table rather than just a chart. This is fighting me every step of the way because I've got it set to snap to the size of the cells. And let me just delete that whole sheet. So most of the time when you're working with pivot tables, you probably want to create a pivot chart. Now the next one along again is the 365 feature. What you want to do is have a play with this, but do that before you've created your pivot table. So when you initially create a pivot table, so let's say we want to put in a pivot table, that's when we want to look at this recommended pivot tables. Because if I click on there, it comes up with some automatically generated pivot tables. Now some of these are garbage. But what it's doing is it's looking at the fields that have numbers in them and saying, how can I summarize these numbers based upon my text fields? So let's have a look at it and say, what do we want to do? Well, salespeople, yep, that might be a useful one. Age group, that might be a useful one. By sum of price. But when I come down here and I say, oh, let's look at salespeople by the sum of count of sale. So this is the count of sale number. That's actually quite useful. But the sum of count of sale certainly wouldn't be useful because these are not actually numbers. So that one there, the sum of the sale number, is meaningless because the sale number is simply the invoice number for that particular sale. So don't assume that these, what are actually insights, are going to be useful, but do have a play with it. But like I say, have a play with it before you create the pivot table rather than on the pivot table you've already created, because what it will do is it will change your pivot table into whichever one you choose here. You'll lose all of your settings, you'll have to redo them. Over here, these last buttons, what we're going to do is take a quick look at them. So the field list is these ones down here. If I click on the X in the corner, the field list disappears, but that's the same as checking the box there, so you can click on it to show or hide the field list. Remember, if I click away from the pivot table, the field list disappears anyway because I'm not in a cell that has a field list. That is a pivot table that has a field list, therefore it appears. The buttons we've talked about already, that's the plus minus buttons if we had groupings, and the field headers are the month and the make, those are the field headers. I actually like to see them, but the reason that I think that button was there as an option to turn it on or off is if you choose to print, you see you have these drop downs here, and these are ways of filtering as well. So you can't filter if you've printed, so you may as well take that button off so that people can't do it. Now the other thing to remember is the default setting is also to show it in compact form, so it says column labels and row labels, which is actually quite annoying and in that case you probably would want to hide them. So I'm going to turn it back on and go back to showing my report layout in tabular form, so this shows month and make, and I will leave all of them turned on. Okay, let's have a quick look at the design options. So subtotals, we did cover this earlier. If we have groupings here, we can have subtotals showing at the bottom of each of the group headings. Grand totals, that's my column and row totals. I've got them both turned on at the moment, and I could choose to have them on or off for each of the columns or rows. My layout, the default is compact form. I will almost always use tabular form, but I either use tabular or outline. Just makes it easier for me to see. It's a layout that I prefer. I'm not saying use it or don't use it, I'm just saying it's the one I prefer. This is the style for the actual pivot table, so I do have the row headers and the column headers. Now previously I could turn off both of them. Here I can turn them on or off just individually. And this is the style of the rows and columns, rather than the actual having the visibility on and off. Banded rows, that's something you might prefer to see, particularly if you have multiple columns. Just makes it easier to read along the rows. And of course we have all these different styles that we can choose. Don't forget to scroll down and have a look at the darker ones as well. Sometimes the darker ones can be useful. And if you choose a solid fill color, it's not giving the option for banded rows, whereas a higher up one does give you the option for the banded rows as well, but you can choose to turn them off even within the banded row style. Okay. Bear in mind again all of these settings that you'd set up. So for example, I might have done this with some custom company colors. I could then of course go into my file and options and go into data and set that as my default pivot table style. Okay, that's all I want to cover for now. I am going to make more videos on pivot tables. We're going to have a look at how we view various different things in here, like the summarizing and showing values as, the different settings we've got there. I think this is enough for this video. We're also going to take a look at much more advanced pivot tables. So using Power Query, Power Pivot, linking tables together to form a data model pivot table, creating relationships and so on. But that will be in the next video. If you have found this video useful, please don't forget to click like and subscribe down below. And once more, thank you for listening.